Welcome to Current Affairs. My name is Nathan Robinson. I am the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I am joined today by Cordelia Fine, professor in the History and Philosophy of Science program at the University of Melbourne, author of books like Delusions of Gender and Testosterone Rex. Professor Cordelia Fine, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thank you for having me. And I've never heard the Testosterone Rex said with such enthusiastic bite. So thank you for that.
Try and bring some drama, you know? So we're here to discuss what comes up in a lot of the work that you've done over the past decade or so, which is, biological gender essentialism and stories that are told about the inherent or hardwired differences between men and women and what their implications are. These stories are often grounded in evolutionary psychology. They are quite popular. You hear it stated, and also stated as scientific fact. Often the narrative is that those who would deny the clear, strong, hardwired differences between men and women are rejectors of science. They are postmodernists, neo-Marxist, feminist ideologues who can't handle the hard truths about a biological reality. We're here to discuss that story today. And I thought perhaps one place we could start is actually not with the story as it's told today, but the story as it has been told over the course of the history of science, because one of the things you do in your book is you start to unsettle our belief in this story, partly by going over all of the stories that have been told in generations past and showing how silly a lot of them look in the rearview mirror.
Yes, that's right. I mean, probably, a nice place to start is Aristotle, who, famously saw women as deficient men who didn't have enough heat to cook their blood and therefore purify the soul. And as a result, they had weaker reasoning powers. And that dichotomy between, rational man and emotional woman has, of course, continued and persists to this day. So in the late 18th and 19th century, the craniologists of the time were very busy trying to identify the cause of sex differences in intellectual achievement. And politically, that was quite an important endeavor because there was a bit of a problem for the Enlightenment thinkers. Why wouldn't the natural rights in the new democracy be extended to women and people who weren't white men? So, there needed to be some kind of rationale for it. And so they were very busy making all kinds of measurements of the skull, what was the volume, what was the ratio of the skull length to the skull breadth. In the mid-19th century, the sort of evolutionary flavor came into things. So there are proposals that women and, members of, non-white races were caught in a kind of primitive stage of physical and mental evolution. One of my favorites from that period, from the late 19th century, was Edward Clarke, who was a medical doctor at Harvard Medical School. And he was quite an influential commentator in the debates about the inclusion of women in higher education. And he drew on limited energy theorem to propose that there was going to be a quite dangerous consequence of allowing women to engage in the hard intellectual labor of attending university because their reproductive systems were themselves use so much energy. And in a limited energy system, that energy would be sucked up to their brains and it would cause infertility, mental health issues, et cetera, et cetera. So the consequences would be quite dire. And what's interesting, you made this comment about the kinds of responses, look, this is just the facts and I'm sorry you don't like them. It's quite interesting to read some of the commentaries of the time because there's still that same kind of patronizing tone, which is very similar to sometimes what you read today.
Can I just quote one of the ones you have in your book? You have a quote from the New York Times in 1915. Dr. Charles Dana, a neurologist commenting on women's suffrage, where he says, there are some fundamental differences between the bony and the nervous structures of women and men. The brainstem of women is relatively larger, the brain mantle and basal ganglia are smaller. The upper half of the spinal cord is smaller. This lower half, which controls the pelvis and limbs, is much larger. These are structural differences which underlie definite differences in the two sexes. And here's where it gets hilarious. I do not say that they will prevent a woman from voting, but they will prevent her from ever becoming a man, and they point the way to the fact that women's efficacy lies in a special field and not that of political initiative or of judicial authority in a community's organization. And I suppose you could use hundreds of such quotes from the papers of the time.
So Edward Clarke was also appropriately cautious. So, I won't say they all go infertile, but, there's just this terrible risk. Actually, if you look on Amazon.com, Edward Clarke's book has quite a few positive reviews. Some people find it a little bit old-fashioned, but quite fascinating. So that's food for thought in itself. I mean, sort of skipping through the 20th century, there was a lot of interest in, links between hormones and brain lateralization, with the idea that, men's more one-sided brains, particular parts of the brain being more developed was sort of underlay their greater intellectual abilities. And where I came in was in the 21st century and the sort of rise of the new brain imaging technology, so structural and functional neuroimaging.
Yes, which I want to get to, but I feel like in that quote that I read from Dr. Charles L. Dana, we can see a tendency that is very common to these arguments across time, which is that what he does, the pattern of reasoning here, the way he draws his conclusion, is to list a series of biological differences between men and women, and then conclude from that a social implication, and that social implication is some kind of limit or some kind of prescription that supposedly follows from the biology. And so there's a science that, we list all these differences and then we say, and that's why society has to be constructed in X way.
Yeah, I agree. There's a kind of unassailable assumption, and then you find the bit of the brain that you can kind of link to that particular conclusion.
I want to read just a headline from The Guardian from 2013 because it's easy for us to mock Dr. Charles L. Dana. This is male and female brains wired differently, scans reveal. So this is the neuroimaging that you were talking about. It says, scientists have drawn on nearly 1,000 brain scans to confirm what many had surely concluded long ago, that stark differences exist in the wiring of male and female brains. A researcher at the University of Pennsylvania who led the study said, the greatest surprise was how much the findings supported old stereotypes, with men's brains apparently wired more for perception and coordinated actions, and women's for social skills and memory, making them better equipped for multitasking. So that's not the New York Times 1915, that's The Guardian 2013.
Gosh, yes, that is a surprise, isn't it? Look, that particular study, which I remember quite well, had some of the common issues that people who have sort of critiqued this kind of work were familiar with, though not all of them. So, one of the main difficulties in this area can often be that conclusions are drawn and work is published on the basis of very small sample sizes. And then those findings don't actually get replicated. And I think there's a kind of interesting underlying assumption behind that, which is the larger the differences between populations, the smaller a sample size you need to sort of reliably identify a difference with a good chance of kind of getting it right. And so the fact that people are willing to compare quite small groups of women and men is an indication that there's a sort of tacit assumption that those differences are quite large. Now, that was not a problem that applied to this particular study because it did have, as you pointed out, it did have a very large sample size. But one of the things that was interesting about the media release that the authors put out is that they were referring to kinds of skills that they didn't actually tap behaviorally. So, for example, I don't believe that they had a behavioral battery of multitasking. So that just sort of did seem to be kind of a pure stereotype. But also, they actually did have a comprehensive battery of cognitive, social, and other kinds of behavioral measures on the larger sample from which their smaller scans from that sample were drawn. And what's actually striking about those data is how very modest the differences are. These were tiny, tiny average differences. And the researchers didn't actually look to see if the connectivity differences which they found between males and females were had any relationship to any of these very modest behavioral measures. And I have to say the connectivity differences themselves were presented in such a way as to sort of emphasize what turned out to be sort of relatively small proportion of connections between the brain that were significant, while kind of not mentioning or not visually showing the many connections that didn't differ between the brains.
Mm.
You know, there's this assumption, and this is quite a common one, and you alluded to it before, but, you know, the idea is that whenever you compare your males and females, whenever you find a difference, there must be some kind of behavioral difference that we need to pin that to. But in fact, you know, another way to think about it is actually we have male and female people. Often they behave in very similar kinds of ways in somewhat different bodies. Sometimes one difference might be to compensate for another difference. So one difference between males and females is an average difference in brain size. And it may be that smaller brains just tend to be wired a little bit differently to larger brains. So that what you're looking at here is a brain size difference and not a sex difference. So that was a sort of possibility in this particular study. People have gone on to look at this more closely, but that wasn't a kind of a consideration that they had when they were looking at their data. They said, we found an average connectivity difference. Let's emphasize that. We found some very modest behavioral differences. Let's connect the two. And then let's write a press release saying this is hardwiring, even though, of course, this is just a snapshot in time. They didn't unwrap their samples from a box.
Yes, I want to talk about this word hardwiring, because I think this comes up a lot, this idea that if we take a look at brains at a particular time and we see differences in wiring, those differences are pre-programmed in, essentially, and have not. And one of the things that you point out in your work is just because you see differences in men and women at a particular time does not mean that you have identified that difference as an innate or hardwired difference.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it's a mistake that, you know, can be quite common in popular commentators. It's in the brain, it must be biological, i.e. innate. You don't tend to see it in scientists, who, of course, understand that the brain is sort of experience dependent. I mean, I think the use of the word referring to kind of innate or hardwiring differences in this particular example you talked about before was a bit of an exception. But there is actually something more subtle going on, or there has been something more subtle going on in the contemporary literature, which is something that I talked about in an academic article that I wrote that did an analysis of 2 years of functional neuroimaging studies of sex differences. And what I found was that there weren't a huge number of these, about 39, but all of them just took a sort of snapshot of differences. So they would just compare the sexes in brain activation. Now, obviously, you can't say from that those brain activation differences are innate, they're universal, they're immutable. But at the same time, if the field is simply taking these snapshots, they can never produce data that would challenge that hypothesis. So they can never produce data that would indicate, actually, no, these differences are seen only in these contexts or only in these populations or only following this kind of developmental trajectory. So there's a kind of subtle difference here in terms of like, what are the data that you're producing? And does the data that you produce actually have the capacity to challenge what may be a kind of tacit assumption that these differences are hardwired? Because you're right, those differences are just a starting point for sort of further investigation. Yeah, sorry, if I just carry on. I mean, this point was made very nicely by two neuroscientists, Daphne Yoel and Margaret McCarthy. And this was talking even about animal research, where obviously you have much more control over what you can do in terms of research. And their point was, you know, when you see a sex difference in some kind of endpoint in animals, so whether it's a brain difference or a behavioral difference, there are all kinds of sex difference that it could actually be. And they sort of set out the kind of tree of what it could be. So you have to ask the question, well, is this difference transient or is it persistent? Is it context dependent? Does it depend on experience or development or, you know, the environment? Or is it context independent? And then you can also ask a question about what form it takes. So do you have a kind of male typical version and a female typical version? Or are there sort of two really distinct forms, or are you seeing a continuum? So, when people say a sex difference in the brain, sure, but what kind of sex difference is it? And that's actually quite a lot of work, some of which may be, in a sense, impossible to sort of explore all the possibilities to work out what kind of sex difference you're talking about, even in animal research.
We've been talking in somewhat general terms. Perhaps you could give us an example of a story that is told of the men are from Mars, women are from Venus, or you cite all these other incredible similar book titles like men are like waffles, women are like spaghetti, why men don't listen and women can't read maps, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Oh, you said why men like straight lines and women like polka dots. Perhaps you could give us an example of a common one of these stories that is supposedly grounded in science, and then why it doesn't hold up when we scrutinize it.
Well, I think one really nice example is actually sort of the spaghetti waffle story, which has been told in many different kinds of ways. So the kind of official scientific label or theory of this is sort of greater male lateralization. So the idea that, and particularly in relation to language, this is the proposal that males tend to use just one side of the brain of the language regions when they're processing language, whereas females tend to use both sides. So they're less lateralized, so to speak. So I'll just say one-sided and two-sided for simplicity. Now, this was a kind of respectable scientific hypothesis in relation to language. And this was looked at both in terms of looking at patients who'd suffered trauma to the brain to see what the effects on their language abilities were, and then later with the neuroimaging technologies, looking at neurologically intact individuals to see are there sex differences in where the brain is processing language. One of these examples where the sort of the smaller scale studies finding sex differences didn't pan out once you started to look at much larger samples. This is a real problem in this area of research because it's so easy to test for sex differences. If you find them, you emphasize them. If you don't find them, you don't mention it. So often the kind of null findings, the findings of similarity, get lost in the literature. And actually, it's kind of interesting because if you want to look for sex differences in the scientific literature, you can put in your keywords, sex differences, gender differences, whatever. It's very hard to look for similarities, right? And we don't have any statistics to measure similarity. So that's a sort of general issue. So the literature looking at, the effects of damage to the brain had sort of started to move away from the lateralization hypothesis, but it was revived with neuroimaging technologies. And this was another interesting case where there are lots of studies with quite small sample sizes looking at it. Some found differences as they expected, some found differences on the other side, some didn't find differences at all. Iris Sommer did two syntheses of this literature called a meta-analysis, and that's where you bring all the studies that have looked at this issue, you make a special effort to look at studies that don't actually report sex differences and just presented people as people, unpublished data. And in both of her meta-analyses, she found that overall, there didn't appear to be a sex difference in language lateralization. But back in 1995, this was in the early days of functional neuroimaging, there had been a study that had looked at 3 different types of language processing and found a sex difference in one. Now, this study emphasized the one finding of difference in its title, even though they found 2 differences of similarity. And that kind of was the spark that lit the fire, that really gave fuel to this idea that men are, one-sided, which became more compartmentalized, which became more waffle.
Oh, okay. Because
mess of the spaghetti.
Well, I'm thinking, what does this have to do with spaghetti and waffles?
We finally got there. Now you understand. And extended beyond language, just be a kind of general phenomenon. So when the female's processing things, it's just like, wow, it's just everywhere. Like the whole brain's just doing everything everywhere. It's a mess, right? And then the reasoning gets mixed up with the emotion and, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas the man, when he's thinking, he's got his thinking part and that's separate to his emotional part. One of these popular books says, that's why men can't talk about their emotions because the language part is very distinct from the emotion part and you can't get a connection between the two. But all of this stems from what was a kind of live scientific hypothesis that eventually was kind of overturned through the sheer weight of data. So actually, when I looked at the citations of that study, it was a very high impact study in terms of how often it was cited in the scientific literature as well as, in the popular literature. And many people were continuing to cite that study even after the meta-analysis was sort of said, look, this small sample hasn't really borne out. Now, I'm not saying this is an issue that's peculiar to sex differences, but when you have such intense popular interest, it doesn't help. Let me put it that way.
So that is a case where a supposed difference was found, but it didn't really hold up once it was researched more extensively. I want to go back to those other categories of cases, however, where if we do find a difference, we are faced with the question of what the source of the difference is. And this is where these debates over innate versus environmental, socially constructed, nature/nurture, this comes in. And one of the points that I think comes across very strongly in your work is that even when the difference holds up, it is extremely, extremely difficult to figure out whether something is the effect of a gendered society and a gendered upbringing, or whether this is hardwired, innate. And you lay out all of the ways in which, from birth, we live in a gendered society that is making it impossible to disentangle the environment from genetics innateness.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, look, one thing to also add is we also don't know what the significance of any difference is for thinking, feeling, behaving, and so on. But, perhaps we can come back to that later, what any particular difference means. But yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, scientists have to be quite ingenious and creative, particularly when it comes to studying humans. But you can't run a controlled experiment when it comes to humans. I mean, I can talk through some of the different ways that scientists have approached this issue.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, one obvious approach is animal research. So you can look at what happens if you actually, if you can tinker with genes, or you can intervene in early hormones that are part of the early sexual differentiation of the brain. I don't think anyone doubts that the genetic and hormonal components of sex do actually have an influence on the brain. The question is, in what ways and with what implications, and in what ways in particular in humans. So animal research is one approach. Another way is to, and this is particularly popular with evolutionary psychologists, is to look across, different cultures and see if you see the same differences consistently cross-culturally. And another popular approach is to look at individuals who have variations in sexual differentiation, so sometimes called intersex conditions. And so, for example, one particularly popular population, and this is often seen as the kind of strongest evidence for kind of inherent sex differences that have implications for behavior, is a group called girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So this is a condition in which the body is producing atypically high levels of androgens in utero, so while it's still in the womb. So the idea is that the brains of these girls is actually kind of having a more male-typical hormonal environment. And so researchers have spent a lot of time looking at this particular group to say, they often have masculinized genitalia, for instance. Are they masculinized in behavioral ways as well? So that's often seen as sort of one of the strongest pieces of evidence for inherent sex differences.
Mm-hmm. And would you agree that it is strong evidence?
Well, look, so there's a kind of consistent finding with this population, which is that when it comes to things like toys and activities, they do have more masculine interests compared with control girls. So that's the kind of clearest finding. And to me, it seems pretty clear cut. I mean, with other kinds of things that have been looked at, it's much less clear. The findings are kind of weak or inconsistent or mixed. But for here, I think that the data are pretty clear. Does that show what people think it shows, which is that boys are just sort of wired to play with trucks and so on? To me, that's not so clear. And the reason is that, for decades, actually, feminist biologists have been criticizing this kind of work, which has been going on in the same kind of way for a very long time, for treating kind of boy toys and girl toys as a kind of timeless, universal, immutable kind of phenomenon, as opposed to something that might actually be socially constructed, if I dare use that term. And actually, when you start to look at the studies themselves, which I did in some detail, so instead of just taking the overall picture, it was like, oh, here's this consistent finding, right? Girls with CAH are more interested in boy toys than control girls. And you start to look at the studies, it becomes kind of interesting. So there can be inconsistency across these kinds of studies in what counts as a boy toy and what counts as a girl toy and what counts as a neutral toy. So, for example, a ball might be a boy toy in one study, or it might be a neutral toy in another, or a teddy bear might be a girl toy in one study, but a gender-neutral toy in another. And you even see examples, actually, where they test their toys on a kind of group of control kids first, and there might be a toy. I think there was a construction toy. I think it's Lincoln Logs construction toy, and they had it in their boy toy set. But the girls loved it. They absolutely loved playing with it, right? So they thought, oh, well, that's no boy toy then. So you start to see the problem here, that there isn't a theory that's saying, we think that testosterone masculinizes the brain in a way that draws it to X, something that involves working out how a system works, or motion, or dominance, or, whatever it might be, or less interested in things to do with feelings or understanding thoughts or belief. That there's not a kind of underlying theory of what's actually going on in brain masculinization. It's just linking it to what is culturally associated with boys and girls in a particular time or place, or even in a particular population. And one really interesting study that came out a few years ago actually took a first step towards looking at this problem indirectly, but didn't kind of mention the criticisms that have been made of this kind of research, which is that they did something different for the first time. And they, instead of presenting children with these groups with toys that are sort of, unambiguously boy toys and girl toys and sort of culturally understood to be that way, they presented them with things that are kind of quite boring and gender neutral, like an orange balloon or a silver balloon, or a toy cow and a toy horse. And they linked them with either gender cues or gender modeling. So, there might be someone saying, this is for boys, or this is for girls, or they saw either a woman or a man kind of playing with the object. And with the control girls and boys, they found the kind of result that you often get, which people kind of overlook, which is, surprise, surprise, when you tell girls and boys who don't have that many social identities at that age, they have some, but they don't have like their professional identities, for instance. Their identity as a girl or a boy is a kind of quite sort of prominent and important one. This is for boys, this is for girls. It influences what they're interested in. And so that came out very clearly in the data.
I have to tell you, I remember being a little boy, and I remember that as a little boy, I played with a lot of cars, and I always wanted the pink Barbie car, but I would never say that I wanted the pink Barbie car because that was a girl toy. I also wanted a Ken doll, which was in the Barbie line, but I know that I would have never chosen a Ken doll because I knew it was a girl's toy from a very young age. And it's very difficult, isn't it, to sort of get children to do these kind of experiments who have no idea what gender is, have no idea that these categories of boy and girl toys even exist, and then conducting experiments on such pure, pristine children that they can't possibly have been influenced by being told that these are the toys that are appropriate for them.
Exactly, yeah. I mean, so there's sort of two interesting studies that come to that. So one is research, people who study gender development. And I remember reading somewhere these researchers talking about how difficult it is to create gender-neutral stimuli because children will latch on to anything that kind of has symbolic femininity or masculinity. So if something is a curved shape, they'll see that as feminine, whereas if it has a sharp shape, they'll see it as masculine. So they have to sort of pre-test their stimuli, and it's incredibly hard to make something gender neutral. And, even before children have this kind of conscious awareness of themselves as boys or girls, there's been studies looking at, how many boy toys, how many girl toys do even very young infants have in their home? And is there a link between that kind of familiarity and sort of later preferences? So, yes, you're absolutely right. And this is a study showing the very unsurprising finding that, yes, children pay note and they are shaped in their responses. Which is not to say that children can't behave in gender non-conforming way and say, no, I will have the Ken doll, but there's a friction there. But what was really interesting in this particular study is that the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they remembered the labels. There wasn't an issue with their memory, but they weren't influenced by it. So they just chose the one that they wanted. And there wasn't a sort of bias towards the one that had been labelled or modelled by women or girls. And to me, this kind of comes right back to this query that I'd had from the research as soon as I started reading about it, which is, what exactly is going on here? Is it this kind of direct link between the effects of androgens on the brain and being drawn to boy toys? Or is there something more complicated going on here, which has to do with something to do with girls, for whatever reason, whether it's to do with the sort of development of the gender identity? They do identify as girls, but their identification as girls is not exactly identical to control girls. Like, is there a kind of indirect route? Like, for whatever reason, they don't have that same, well, this is my tribe, and so I need to kind of conform to what's right for me. Then for some reason, they're not internalizing those gender norms. And so, the researchers presented this as, here's another route by which we might see, gender differentiated interests. But to me, the question is, well, what route is the traditional findings? And I think that really remains an open question at this point.
I reviewed a few months ago a horrible transphobic documentary by a right-wing pundit called What is a Woman? And it aims to prove that sex and gender are innate, fixed biological categories. And he shows, that women, they are gender roles and they're prescribed for us. And one of the funny things is in that documentary, he goes to speak with an indigenous group somewhere in Africa, and I can't remember what the name of the group is, but the men he talks to, he's trying to prove that gender roles are universal across cultures. And he says, well, do women do this? Do men do this? And they say, yes, they do that here too. And he goes, see, well, even here among these people. And I couldn't help but notice that all of the men he was talking to in this ethnic group were all wearing what would be in the United States called a colorful skirt. Not among them, but they were all wearing, and what was associated with masculinity among the people he was talking to, something that didn't apparently attract his attention, was the fact that all of the men that he was speaking to were wearing dresses, which was considered perfectly normal in the country that he was in.
Yeah, I mean, this is a good point. And some of these studies have looked at, girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia and career interests, and here we start to get at, we're not just talking about toys here, but we're talking about the economy, what roles people play in the economy. And, interesting findings showing more interest on the part of the girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia with the sort of male typical careers. But, when you go back and look at the early studies making these kinds of investigations, that what was considered a kind of feminine jobs, pro-feminine roles, was so constricted and old-fashioned. And you think, well, there is some variation in what are men's jobs and women's jobs. Like, why don't we expand our scope a little bit here if we are actually interested in exploring this question and use that? I know these things are difficult to do. You have to have your population and have a relationship with them and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not saying this is an easy thing to do, but I think this is this general tendency to, exactly as you say, to sort of assume that what's considered masculine, here and now in my particular culture and time is a kind of timeless phenomenon. And we can link that, let's link that to early biology. Rebecca Jordan-Young has a really interesting, her book, Brainstorm, makes this point really beautifully and persuasively about the study of male and female sexuality, which is trying to be linked to these early hormones. And she makes the point that, this research maybe started, I hope I got this right, sort of in the 1950s or so, and it carries on. And there was a sort of whole sexual revolution in the meantime. And so the very kind of cultural understanding of what feminine sexuality in particular was evolved. So, it started off as wedding fantasies, and then it became something that was a bit more, like actually having sexual desires or sexual fantasies, or maybe even being interested in having sex. Can you believe that? So the sort of conception of feminine sexuality in particular had changed a lot. The band of what was just considered kind of human sexuality became much larger. But all the while, it was like scientists hadn't noticed that what they were kind of trying to pin early hormones to had actually changed as the culture had changed. So, coming right back to your point about the Charles Darner, you see something in the world and you try and explain it with the biology. It's like, well, women can't vote. Nobody's going to run that study now.
Yeah.
Because the phenomenon has changed.
Well, it interests me, every time I see people like Jordan Peterson say these things about, in egalitarian societies, that you have a bunch more men as engineers and more women as teachers or whatever. I think to myself, but you can't isolate the effect of the fact that that's how the professions already are. If you were to try and to actually test it, you'd have to have an experimental alternate society in which women were told that engineering was a female profession, and they were told that from the beginning. And then you'd see whether they, in fact, went into the profession that was stereotypically associated. But if you switched it, but of course you can't switch it. You can only work in the society that you're in, where people are being told that all of these observed behavioral differences are in fact associated with a particular gender. You can't get people out of the water of society that they swim in.
Of course, you're right. And, the phenomenon you're referring to is sometimes called the gender equality paradox. And the counter response would be, well, look, actually, when you look at the countries like Sweden, Finland, Norway, these are the countries which, whenever we have our gender equality, cross-cultural gender equality indice measures, they're right at the top. So these are the most gender egalitarian countries in the world. And yet, when you look at the proportion, people looked at a bunch of different things. When you look at for example, the number of girls and women graduating from STEM, you actually see a greater gender gap in countries like Sweden than you do in somewhere like Iran, which, obviously is no champion of women's rights and scores very low on these kinds of measures. And, their argument would be, well, these are the countries where you have the kind of least constraints of gender. And in addition, because they're wealthy countries, this is where kind of women's and men's true preferences can reveal themselves. So that's the argument. Now, and that's the kind of argument that Jordan Peterson is making in terms of the gender equality paradox. So I think there are a number of interesting things to say about this. So one, and this often gets overlooked, when these studies come out, is people are interested in the relationships between gender equality measures and, whatever it is you're tracking, whether it's personality, whether it's economic preferences, whether it's STEM. What gets overlooked is just how much variation there is on these variables cross-culturally, including almost always, there might be some exceptions, but you can usually find several countries where what we think of as what's masculine and what's feminine, or what's more common in men versus more common in women, is actually reversed. So there are often really interesting examples of that. So that in itself is, we're not talking about universal patterns here. So, that really comes back to our point about variation cross-culturally and, just how malleable some of these things are. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the idea that when you look at somewhere like Sweden, you're kind of looking at some gender-free or gender-neutral country or near enough, that really does seem like a mistake to me. When you think about, there's a particular structure to post-industrial societies and a particular structure and history of the labour market. And this, sociologists have been looking at this in kind of complex and sophisticated ways. And so the rise of women's rights came with the growth of the service sector and the service sector economy, women became a kind of very convenient labor force to fill demand in those particular sectors. Often those sectors were seemed like women's work, the kind of professionalization of women's traditional work in kind of caring and teaching and so on. And as a result, this kind of routine non-manual labor became known. It became the default home for women, and it kind of accommodated to care and responsibilities as well. And the public sector in places with very strong welfare states is very large. And the point is that the same structural characteristics that go with enabling women to integrate into the labor market, so things like having access to education, having reliable contraception, the lighter load of unpaid domestic labor, thanks to technology and the provision elsewhere, at the same time actually goes hand in hand with more sex segregation within the labor market itself. The mistake is to think all of these things that push us towards greater gender integration, they all go together. There's just one dimension, gender difference, gender equality, and they all work in the same way along the same dimension. Funnily enough, things are much more complicated than that. People have talked about the fact that there is such generous parental leave in countries like Sweden actually can act against integration in the labour market because, particularly where you have strong worker provisions, having someone who you think will take a year's maternity leave does not become a very appealing prospect to an employer, for example. So there are all kinds of interesting and complicated things going on. But I think one point which was made recently in a paper that was sort of looking at this idea that, the reason that we have fewer women in STEM in Sweden is because they're just inherently less interested in it, is to point out that when we think about gender ideology, it's not just patriarchy, anti-patriarchy. These authors talk about there being at least two dimensions to gender ideology. And one is a kind of vertical dimension, a kind of male supremacy. Men are superior, they should be in charge, they should be the head of the household, it's women's jobs to service them, etc. But then there's also this horizontal dimension, which is men are from Mars, women are from Venus. Men are like this, women are like that. And if you reject the male supremacy, the vertical dimension, which we do in kind of, modern egalitarian countries like Sweden, etc., Australia, but we keep the horizontal dimension, we have a kind of different but equal ideology. And what these authors showed, I think that was led by Thomas Breeder and colleagues, believe it or not, there's actually a negative correlation between the two. So countries where you have a kind of stronger endorsement of this vertical dimension have a lower endorsement of the horizontal dimension and vice versa. And that's actually reflected in the data looking at people's interest in STEM subjects. So part of the data that people have looked at is the gender gap in how much boys and girls enjoy STEM, maths and STEM. Sorry, maths is part of STEM, apologies. And you actually see also, like in these more gender egalitarian countries, the countries that score higher on these indices, there's a bigger gender gap. So there's something going on in these countries that is telling girls, this isn't for me, I don't enjoy this, more so than in other countries. So, I think the short answer to all this is we actually don't know what's going on in the gender equality paradox.
Right.
But there's certainly much more complicated things going on than simply in Sweden, finally women are able to express their, in these countries which are so extraordinary in human history, finally women reveal their true selves.
Yeah.
Probably a bit of a simplistic take.
So I take it what you're saying is it could be that, they don't believe in patriarchy, but they still believe in stereotypes. They still have roles and stereotypes, and they haven't gotten rid of those. They've just created certain kinds of equality, but not others. It doesn't really prove very much. If you have time, I have two more questions for you.
Sure, yeah.
These are the ones I wanted to make sure to ask you. The first is all evolutionary psychology bullshit, or is there just a lot of bullshit in evolutionary psychology?
Oh, gosh. No, it's a legitimate, important line of study to think about evolutionary processes, both ultimate factors and the kind of proximal factors, and to think about those. So I don't think it's very helpful for the kind of work that I do or my colleagues do to just sort of be dismissed as just feminist ideology masquerading as science without engaging with it. We shouldn't do the same on the other side. Let's just take each theory or account or study case by case. Mm-hmm. I think, to sort of slightly take a tangent from your question, I would really like to see much more engagement between different perspectives in science. So evolutionary psychologists talk a lot about the importance of viewpoint diversity, etc. I completely agree. So let's actually engage in some of that and talk about some of the underlying assumptions in evolutionary psychology and, to what extent they're borne out of,
Actually, that gets me nicely to the last question I had for you. I was hoping you could tell our listeners and readers what it is that you feel that feminism has to contribute to science that actually improves scientific inquiry as scientific inquiry. You just mentioned there's this whole thing about, that feminist science is somehow diluting the quest for truth and pure objective knowledge. And you very strongly argue the opposite, that in fact it is a corrective that is helping us get closer to authentic understanding of the way things really are.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is absolutely the case. So whether you want to call it feminist perspectives on science or gender analysis, what it can do is, I think your question about evolutionary psychology and the point that you made right back at the beginning of the interview about Charles Darwin of, it's so easy for us to be shaped by the particular gendered culture that we live in. And of course, scientists aren't immune to that process. And so it is very helpful to have people who are kind of trained or thoughtful or reflective in thinking about the influence of gender norms, gender stereotypes, gender schemas, even, the gender of practitioners, and think about how that is influencing and biasing science. And, there are so many examples of this. When you look at this history in science, it is so often, not always women who say, I'm a feminist, but often it is, who say, look, here are the problems. Here are the problems with this account. So they've been sort of pulling out these unexamined assumptions, taking a look at them, challenging them, suggesting new ways to think about issues. When I wrote Testosterone Rex, I didn't sort of set out for it to be a kind of celebration of women in science, but it just so often turned out that there were so often women scientists who were like, hang on a minute, let's just take a breath here and look at this assumption that's being made. Certainly not always, but it was often the case. This is one of the things that I feel that we are making progress in terms of having these perspectives being integrated into mainstream scientific journals, being taken seriously, having legitimacy among mainstream scientists. I think that's been a really positive shift that I think I've noticed since I've been working in this area. My worry is that this kind of the polarization of these debates about science and gender will start to undermine that progress, which I think would be a real loss.
Yeah. That's why I wanted to just take the opportunity here to just push back so hard against this notion that feminism politicizes or dilutes science. As you pointed out, what we're actually talking about is the fact that everyone has biases and assumptions, and we do better science where we try to understand those things. Your first book, which is also really cool, which we didn't get to talk about, is kind of how the many ways in which the brain is an idiot, and the many ways in which are the most intelligent of us can really not know how much we're failing in different ways.
That's right. And look, I have to say, I mean, the benefits, of course, will run both ways. If people are only responding to your work by saying you're just a biased ideologue, well, that doesn't help you improve your work either. Like, we all have confirmation biases. And to the extent that we are just operating in silos, or when you do engage with other people's work, they just ignore it. Like, that's not how science is supposed to work. The reason science has been such a success is that you're harnessing other people's ability to spot the flaws in your work because of they held their particular perspective and they don't agree with yours. So they're the best possible person to spot out what you're doing wrong. And, the benefits run in all directions.
Well, Professor Cordelia Fine, your books, such as Delusions of Gender and Testosterone Rex and A Mind of Its Own, How Your Brain Distorts and Deceives, are books that I want to give to a lot of people to read, and then there are some people who I just want to whack over the head with your books, because I don't know how to get them to understand some of the points that you make here, but I feel like they're pretty critical. So, Professor Cordelia Fine, thank you so much for joining us on Current Affairs today.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you.
The Current Affairs Podcast is a product of Current Affairs Magazine. If you are not subscribed to Current Affairs Magazine, visit currentaffairs.org/subscribe today and get our glorious print edition. The Current Affairs Podcast is released regularly every week on patreon.com/currentaffairs. Thanks for listening.